Okay, so this is the second video lecture on the topic of death and preparing for death. Again, thanatology, that could be a quiz question, is the study of death and dying. This slide, or in this video lecture, I want to talk about grief and the stages of grief. Again, if you're a social worker type, you will become very familiar with this. We talk about grief as being a process, but that it's also never over. The stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And generally, people like my father's been dead now 23 years, and I can say that I continue to grieve. Right, I have accepted it, but sometimes you're going to go back and forth, right? So denial is it's not happening. Then you might get angry. Then you might sort of attempt to bargain with God, that if only you will let them live just 2 more days, just 2 more years, and then we'll get to sadness or depression, and then acceptance, sort of go back and forth. But basically, people never finish grieving there, but it gets better, but it never really goes away. All right, so this is a really important topic, and there are a couple quiz questions about this one, about choosing how to die. Again, the big crisis or the big takeaway from this chapter is death with dignity, and what exactly does that mean? It certainly means different things, or a good death means different things to different people. But it's basically the idea is that you die on your own terms. So suicide is certainly one way that we can be an active decision maker in our own death. And there's different ways to think about death by suicide or dying by suicide. Is it rational? Is it something? Is the person of their clear mind, or is it an emotional decision? One of the things that I remember learning about, a friend of mine's husband died by suicide, and we used to talk a lot about his death. And one of the things that I learned from her is that professionals argue that a person who is intent on ending their own life, you won't know, right? I mean, you can't prevent it. When someone dies by suicide, it doesn't. You did not cause that to happen. That's a decision that they made on their own. I have another acquaintance who died by suicide, and I remember, and prior to her, nobody suspected it at all. And people had actually observed, and this is not uncommon either, for people who have made that decision. Often their mood improves, and some argue that that's because up until this point they may have been deliberating a decision, they were unhappy, and once they've settled on this decision, they feel better about it. And so what this woman did is she had all of her affairs in order. She had boxes of like who was going to inherit her house. She was a single woman with no kids. Who was going to inherit her house? She had told her friends she was going away. I remember I asked her to be on a committee, and she said she couldn't because she was going away for a while. She went to the cemetery and she shot herself, but right before she killed herself, she called the police and said, "You're going to find a body in the cemetery in this particular place." And she did that in part because it wouldn't diminish the property value of her house. And then she had all of her money given away to all these different charities. So the point is that we can argue that this is a selfish thing to do, or that it's irrational. Okay, moving on. So we got some methods, some terms associated with hastening death. Euthanasia, what does that mean? Euthanasia simply stands for a good death. There are different kinds of hastening death or good deaths. You have a phenomenon called passive euthanasia, and the quiz question is offer an explanation or an argument in support of and an argument opposed to hastening or euthanasia, or whatever term you want to use. So passive euthanasia is when treatment is withdrawn from the individual. So this story over here, these images are a woman by the name of Terry Schiavo, and this was her right prior to her accident. She was engaged to be married. This is her, I don't know, something on the order of 20 years later. I don't remember if she was married, maybe she was recently married, and she remains today in a vegetative state. I think she's still alive. and there was all kinds of controversy because her parents wanted her to stay alive, wanted to continue to feed her. Obviously, she can't take care of herself, any of her own needs. She's nonverbal. And her husband argued, or her boyfriend, or whatever his relationship to her was, that she would not have wanted to have stayed in that state. So they took the people that loved her, went to court over keeping her alive or not keeping her alive, right? Passive euthanasia would be, in the case of Terry Schiavo, where you simply withhold food, right? Or maybe if they're fed with a tube or if they're on an IV, you simply withhold any treatment. And in that case, you would starve. Active euthanasia would be where someone does something to hasten your death, like maybe gives you an overdose of a tranquilizer or a pain medicine, or maybe even, and then you have assisted, and I think it might be on this next one, assisted euthanasia, where it would be a doctor would offer resources that you would then use yourself to hasten your death. All right, a really important term, a couple terms on this slide that are on quizzes are what is a living will. And a living will this is different than a will about property, right? Think this is actually a quiz question because students often get it wrong. This is a document that I would write, and again, it's for my loved ones, where I would spell out, this is what I want towards the end of my death, or in the event that I was in a car accident and could not make my own decisions, I do want IVs, or I don't want IVs, or I don't want feeding tubes, and you would make very clear what kind of death you want, so that people, like in Terry Schiavo's case, they don't end up in a situation like this because she has spelled out, right, what her will is, what she wants. And again, think of these things not as morbid, but think of them as ways that you can love your family, right? So they don't have to make these decisions. A do not resuscitate order. Now, living wills in the state of Kansas are not considered legally binding, so family members don't have to follow them. You would hope they would. But a do not resuscitate, or a DNR, is a legal document. And so when my father was dying at his house, he had by his door of his house this great big DNR sign, so that if emergency personnel, if paramedics showed up, they would know that if he had his heart stopped, he was not to be resuscitated. That's another sort of way of saying, this is the kind of death I want. Do not hook me up to machines. Durable power of attorneys is a document that gives someone else the power to make all of your decisions, right? Your financial decisions, your legal decisions, your custody decisions. A medical durable power of attorney. Now, I have medical durable power of attorney for a friend of mine, means that I have, if she is not capable of making her own decisions, I have the power to make decisions about her medical care. And again, or sometimes they call them healthcare proxies. And these are intended so that if a person is unable to express their wishes to a doctor, for whatever reason, they're unconscious, blah, 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 someone who knows them, and theoretically you know them well, can say, no, this person does not want that, right? That they have that authority to do those things. Okay. More sort of the same, assisted suicide. So where this one, you have passive euthanasia, where you just let this person, you just withdraw, and you let them starve to death or dehydrate. Active euthanasia is where you help them, or they, what does that one say? Active euthanasia, where you do something. So one kind of active euthanasia would be assisted suicide. And so this is where the individual does something to themselves to hasten their death, but they are assisted by a doctor. And so again, this is a quiz question. This is a short answer one. To offer a reason why, this is an argument in support and an argument opposed. Some of the arguments in support of assisted suicide say this is the most basic way for a person to control their life, right? That why would it be that in life they can make their medical decisions, but towards their death they can't? And if they are of sound mind and they want someone to help them die, they should have that choice, right? Another argument is that the doctors, this would be an argument against actually, that doctors take an oath to do no harm, right? And if they are to facilitate the end of someone's life, they are doing harm. However, there's also a doctor's argument that says that a doctor knows best. They would know the most ethical, pain-free way to help someone in their life. So the doctor is the best one, is in the best position to help someone make that decision about their physical autonomy. Right? I mean, sure, I could commit suicide, but I don't know what's going to hurt and what's not going to hurt. But a doctor could. They could help me with these things. There's arguments that this is a slippery slope, that we start saying, well, it's okay for this person to help this person die, but when would it? I mean, can we imagine a scenario where somebody just says, well, I don't feel good today and I want to end my life? That's not a very good example, but it's a slippery slope kind of argument. There's other arguments that say that maybe we would be less afraid if we knew that we could die when we wanted to die. There's some evidence that people in general support this. There's also questions about all life is sacred and who should decide. It shouldn't be us as people who get to make this decision, but it should be God who gets to decide. Right? Okay. And then hospice care. Well, I'll stop right here, and then in the next one I'll talk about grief and bereavement and briefly about what exactly hospice care is about.